If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. This is Beyond BJU, and I'm your host, Andrew Pledger. And this is a little bit different of an episode that I did with the IndoctriNation podcast that's hosted by Rachel Bernstein, a therapist and cult specialist. I do social media work for the podcast, and I asked Rachel and the team if it was okay if I put this episode on here because I just love the conversation so much and I didn't think I could recreate it. In the episode, I really talk about just the overall experience of a Bob Jones University student and just all of the isolation, the control. The first 30 minutes of the episode, we actually discuss a lot about my relationship with my parents. If you don't want to hear that, you can skip 30 minutes through and get to where I start talking about Bob Jones University. This was recorded in, I think, May or June of 2023, just to keep it in mind, because some of the things that are mentioned might confuse people, but that's when it was recorded, so it was before the release of Surviving Bob Jones University podcast. But I really just enjoyed this conversation with Rachel. She is such a great conversationalist. She's very empathetic, and she has a lot of great insights, and it honestly felt like a therapy session. So I hope you enjoy this episode. If you want to hear more episodes on the IndoctriNation podcast, I'll link that in the show notes.
Thanks for tuning in to our Patreon exclusive bonus episode. Listeners like you are the reason we keep the show going, so thanks so much for your support. And enjoy this bonus interview as our thanks to you. It is so nice to have Andrew Pledger back on the show, the social media director extraordinaire of the podcast and an all-around good person. I know that you want to come on and talk about some new things and new developments, new things that have been explored by you. And so I can't wait to get into that whole discussion. If you can spend a couple moments just introducing yourself again, that would be great.
Of course. Yeah, I'm so excited for this, and I'm glad we could work this out. But for people who do not know me, my name is Andrew Pledger, and I was raised in the independent fundamental Baptist movement, a very strict movement with a strict code of conduct, heavy emphasis on hell and end-time prophecies, and they claimed that the KJV Bible was the absolute truth and the only word of God. I was homeschooled my entire life for the purpose of indoctrination by my mother. And it was interesting because my parents, they also grew up in the IFB, and they were convinced it was the truth, and they wanted to indoctrinate me and my brothers. And growing up in that very isolated and high control environment, I then realized very late on, which is understandable in that kind of environment when you don't have any kind of sex education at all, but I realized that I was gay, and being that in that environment was seen as an abomination. You were compared to murderers, you were compared to pedophiles. So it was one of the worst things that you could be in that environment, and it caused a lot of religious trauma from that. And when I graduated from homeschooling, the control was not going to stop there. My parents would only help me go to a fundamentalist Christian college. And the one that I ended up going to was Bob Jones University. And this is really what I want to talk about today, the experiences I had at that university. I was there for 3.5 years, and I was expelled my senior year for publicly telling my story of growing up in the IFB, denouncing its teachings, and then coming out of the closet. So all these different things that was seen as a threat to that system of control. I was going against authority. I was going against the flow. I was not conforming and being silent anymore. And Bob Jones University did not like that. And so I was expelled my very last semester of my senior year. I laugh about it now, but it wasn't funny when it happened.
I'm sure it was not hilarious at the time.
And
yes,
I'm excited to announce that I recently just finished my bachelor's degree. I transferred. So there you go, Bob Jones. I finished.
right.
The big part is I recently announced I'm doing a limited podcast on Bob Jones University. It's called Surviving Bob Jones University, a Christian Cult. And it digs into the history of Bob Jones, the psychology of fundamentalism, the criteria for cults, which I'm excited to have you come on the podcast, Rachel, to share your expertise. And I'll also be interviewing survivors from various backgrounds.
It's really great. And I'm really glad that you've put that together. I'm curious about the idea for that and how that came together because, I think when you're raised the way you're raised, there's real fear that's instilled in you about being out, about anything that's different or that's in opposition, about being gay, kind of gay in public, whatever that means, but just being out. And then I think also just about saying, this is not how I feel. This is not what I believe. And this is why I can't believe this anymore. And this is why I think this is wrong. And being able to put a show together. I mean, I just think about having your hand slapped in such a major way by being expelled right before you had a chance to finish up and graduate, to come back from that and to have the courage to say, okay, no. I know about myself that I have this impetus to share the truth as I see it and as other people might see it, even though I had my hand slapped, even though I had to come back from that moment on my own and find a way to finish up in my own time, which is hard to do when people have to take a break from school. Just getting back into the mode of school once you've been working, it's a very hard thing to do, but not impossible, just hard. And so here you are doing this limited series. Do you find that there's any residual fear, that like conditioned fear that comes up in you?
Yeah, I think the only fears that I have about making it, I think, has been the backlash from people from Greenville and for those still affiliated, which I have seen online. And I've been working with a therapist for a year and a half now, working through my trauma from my religious background in general, and working on this series. I know it is already as a healing experience for me, and I think it will be for other survivors. But one of the hardest things as I've been working on this series is listening to old sermons to integrate into the podcast. Just that language and like the fear that comes up in my body from that. And the other fears, I guess, that I have is that I think it's still like that people pleaser that's still deep down inside of me, which is something I had to like greatly overcome to even like tell my story in the first place. But I think there's still remnants of it inside of me because I know that there are people that are loving that I'm making the podcast, and there are people that are really, really angry. And I know there are people who hate me and what I'm doing.
Oh, I can't imagine. You're the nicest person. But I guess, it doesn't matter in these contexts sometimes, unfortunately, as well as much as it should. When you were talking about being homeschooled by your mom, if we can go back to that for a moment, I don't know, we haven't really talked about this, about your relationship and what that's been like. And I mean, she was a fundamental part of your fundamentalism from a young age. So where is she on all this?
The relationship with my mom after publicly leaving that background and denouncing it. In the very beginning, in therapy for me, I had this extreme anger and this hatred towards both of my parents for the way that they raised me and the way that they affected me. But after only a year and a half of therapy, I've been surprised at the perspective that I've had of them that has changed. And especially as I've listened to your podcast and learning about mind control and indoctrination, seeing, especially now seeing my mom, she's a victim of this system that she was born into. And I think she's had her own harm from it, and kind of learning to see from their point of view that I recently saw a video where someone's like the poor parents whose kids leave these environments and the parents believe their children are going to be tortured for eternity. So I know that's something that she has to deal with and that she believes, sadly. And I'm sure it was devastating where you dedicate your entire life to your child to bring them up in this system of control, believing that it's the truth, believing that it's the only way and that it's the right thing. And then your child leaves it all behind. Like, I know that has not been easy to deal with. And those were things that I even thought about a little bit before I left. But I have to be my own person. I have to be an individual. I can't spend the rest of my life denying every part of myself to please a higher authority, which is what I did my whole childhood. And the relationship with my mother has been really surface level since I've left. Like, we're still in contact. I've set boundaries with her. I told her, you can't talk to me about religion. You can't mail me Bible verses. You can't. And then even my own dad, he would sometimes send me sermons from the IFB. And I'm like, you can't send me sermons from the environment. I don't want, like, I've had enough of that. And so setting those boundaries, because, you know, when I was expelled, I was expecting my parents to cut me off until I came crawling back, because there was an experience in my family where we had a cousin, long story short, who came out of the closet and then also left the faith. And I was told by my parents to never talk to them again. None of the family, we could never talk to them, because if we did, then maybe they wouldn't come back to the faith. So it was our family's way of, we're going to break them by cutting them off from everyone in the family. And they're going to come crawling back like the prodigal son. They're going to ask for forgiveness and repent and come back to the truth. But that never happened. And I think my family learned from that wasn't going to work. That person was able to create a life of their own outside of our family, outside of the IFB. So here I am, I'm expecting to be cut off, and because of knowing that past experience. And so when my parents didn't cut me off after leaving that background, they were worried I was going to cut them off. Actually, it was interesting. And so I said, you know, I'm fine to keep that contact, but I'll set these various boundaries. I mean, it's still been hard because there's just so much that I can't share with them. Like, even for working for you, Rachel, there's stuff I know, I can't, like, I don't talk about it that much because I know she doesn't like that I work for you. And what you do is uncomfortable, I think, to her, and like that cognitive dissonance. And, you know, cult members don't want to think that they're in a cult at all. It's like everyone else but them. And, you know, I think it's hard because I know, like, my parents don't even know I have a podcast. Like, I've never told them about that either, because I know they wouldn't like that. And it's hard because, like, I was never enough for them. I know I'll never be. And I was told growing up that, you know, we don't care what you do. We just want you to be a full-time Christian. And my mom was very adamant. She's like, and I hope you have a Sunday school class in a church that you go to also. So it was like, oh, we want you to do whatever you want, but also we want you to be a full-time Christian in the IFB and believe exactly what we do. I think what made it easier for me to speak out was the moment that I realized it didn't matter if I conformed to the system, it still wouldn't be enough, because my older brother, he is a youth pastor in the IFB movement. And my parents still aren't happy with some of the things that he believes or some of the things that he does. And so when I realized that, I'm like, here's a brother that I thought was their favorite my whole life, who's conformed to their system and who is in the IFB as a youth pastor, and it's still not enough. And so I'm like, it's like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So for me, when I got to the point where I decided to tell my story, I was like, I know this will never be enough. And I think that is the hard thing, is that I'll never be loved and accepted by my parents. There's a part of my life I'll never be able to share with them, and it's only a very surface, shallow level relationship. And I think that's kind of the harder part of that is, yeah, I'm still in contact with them. I'm still in contact with my mother, but it's not a very satisfying relationship, I don't think.
I mean, just hearing you use that phrase that I'm not enough for them and I will never be enough for them. I think about all the people I know who have parents who were not in support of their life for one reason or another, and made mention of it, like couldn't not talk about it, and made decisions to be very punitive in the hope that it meant that someone would come back to the fold. Like if they're marrying someone who the family didn't approve of, so they wouldn't go to the wedding, because somehow that was going to motivate kids to, to fall in line. It rarely, if ever, does. And that a parent can have a lot more say and a lot more, I think, inroads, relationship, influence about the things that matter to them if they stay in contact, if they show support. But I think people don't necessarily realize that. How interesting and how enlightening for you to see that your brother still is not given carte blanche and absolute acceptance, even though he's towing the line to a great degree, and maybe because that's how he really believes. It makes me wonder just about the nature of IFB, and even with Bob Jones, that is there this idea that you are supposed to, like, somehow it's the right thing to do to look at someone through a critical lens, and that's helping to keep them in line or helping to guide them or teach them, and that you can't ever just say, I love you unconditionally. Like somehow that's not being a good Christian.
Yeah, it's interesting because they twist words or redefine them in that environment, in the IFB and even Bob Jones. And I remember growing up, it was really confusing to me in the IFB because, and even when I got to Bob Jones, was that they would talk about at times God's love, but so many of their sermons were based on so much fear and shame. And it's like they would kind of go back and forth between, oh, God is really loving. Oh, but also he is a just God, and he is jealous, and he's wrathful, and he's angry. And if you don't believe this, you'll be punished. You'll be damned for eternity. And for people who don't know, like the IFB, they have the plan of salvation. So you say this prayer, and once you say this prayer, you have a ticket to heaven, and no one can take that away from you. And the interesting thing was they would call it eternal security. That's what they called it. They're like, you have eternal security in this belief system. But they would always make you doubt that you even had eternal security. They would tell you that, oh, if you don't show signs of being saved, and signs of being saved were that, you agreed with their theology, you liked going to the church, you obeyed all of their rules. And if you broke one of their rules and you didn't feel guilt about that, that's a sign that you're not saved because you don't have the Holy Spirit inside of you. And so when you see someone breaking the rules, the most loving thing you can do to them in that environment is shame them for it and be hateful, because you're saving them from eternal damnation. That's the most loving thing you could do. You're saving them. It doesn't matter how mean or harsh you are saving them from an eternity in hell. So this justified a lot of judgmental and harsh behavior for people who weren't following the rules perfectly. And there was no unconditional love at all.
Right. Right. What I hope is that your folks can see you, can really see your life at some point and see that you're happy and see that you probably seem a lot happier than before. But I wonder about the value placed on happiness and if that does matter, or not.
Mm, yeah. And that's interesting because in that environment and even at Bob Jones, it's taught that this is the way you find true joy. This is the way you find true happiness. And if there's signs of mental health issues, you're blamed and shamed for it because you're not believing enough, you're not praying enough. Because if you conform and if you believe what they believe, you'll automatically have the joy of the Lord. And, for me, I tried to find that happiness and joy in that group, but I couldn't. For me, that was seen as a sign of spiritual weakness or a sign of spiritual inferiority. And I think also getting out, I thought it was unrealistic the way they approached happiness. It was like, let's avoid all the things we don't like about ourselves. Let's demonize that. Let's put that aside. Let's repress that and cling on to these verses or this belief in a higher power. For me, kind of letting go of that idea of, oh, I can reach happiness if I do this, if I do this, and trying to get to a point of like, let's just learn to just be, which I'm still working on, just enjoy the present because in that environment, you're so, so busy. They keep you so busy, like in the IFB and, at Bob Jones University, they have all these required activities that you do that they tell you that, oh, this is for your spiritual growth. This is for you to get closer to God. But it was just a continuation of indoctrination and a way to stop people from thinking for themselves and deciding on their own beliefs. And, when I left, didn't have the expectation that, oh, I'm going to be completely happy now, because I knew that I would still have to deal with the effects of the trauma from the environment. And I think I had to accept that life isn't going to be perfect. And, my life was definitely not perfect at all in any way. But I think letting go of that idea of constantly trying to reach this state of happiness, I think that caused so much harm because then you feel shame when you're not in this state of joy or bliss. It was very counterintuitive. So I think learning just to like remove these weights that they put upon me was part of like, and as I continue to, was part of that healing and trying to not have this unrealistic goal and expectations of living life and just learning to just embrace my humanity in every part of me.
Hmm. I'm wondering just one more thing about your parents before we move on to other things, if you want, is if you think they're happy. Like, do you feel like they're living good lives? Because like, so many people who are religious, if you say, are you happy? They'll be like, what? Like, it doesn't come up. And sometimes people are happy in certain states because they just have learned not to feel certain feelings. Like they've learned how to transcend certain feelings or dissociate, actually, as we would say in the field. And so is that real happiness or is it just being in an altered state? What do you think?
I do not think that my parents are really happy. I think they've been able to have, and I think this is why they are in this environment, is there's an element of comfort and an illusion of certainty that comes to it, and this feeling of being special and being important. And it's kind of contradictory because in the IFB, you're beaten down and told that you're so worthless. But as I've learned, that environment models a narcissistic, abusive relationship because there's these moments of where you are like spiritually, emotionally abused, But then these like breadcrumbs of like emotional highs of, oh, you're so important, you were chosen, you were loved by God, and these euphoric feelings of being special, and then you're put down again. It's just that weird contrast of that. And that's something I experienced in that environment of just feeling so worthless. And then every once in a while, they would just bring you up and get you to this high of feeling so special and chosen by God. And I think they have a lot of unprocessed trauma from their own families. And I think from the religious environments they grew up in. And I don't think they've ever processed it. I think they use religion as a way to avoid deeper issues, to spiritually bypass what's really going on. Because growing up, you're taught in this environment, they tell you how to feel and what you feel, and they tell you they have the answer to get rid of that awful feeling. So I was told that this feeling of emptiness that you have, it's this God-shaped hole that you have in your soul, and salvation through the Bible and through the gospel. So saying this prayer, once you do it, that will go inside of you and fill that hole, and you can have a relationship with Jesus. For me, I thought, oh, I have feelings of extreme emptiness. I feel so worthless. I feel so empty. I want this to be filled. But I didn't realize it was because my emotional and psychological needs weren't being met in the environment. There are a lot of developmental issues because of my family, and I did not belong. I always fitted in. I didn't have that feeling of belonging in that environment and that sense of safety. And so that was the core issue of my emptiness. But I didn't even consider that, or I didn't even question the group as being toxic from a young age because I was taught it was the truth. And so me questioning that and later on realizing that people are complex. There's no simple answer. There's no magic pill. There's no spiritual teaching that is just going to take all of this away at all. Like, I don't care what anyone says that they have this way, that you do this and you'll be fine. I think I learned that, especially as I've left, I'm like, there are deeper issues that'll take me years to work through in therapy, but I'm not going to be like my family, and I'm not going to avoid it. And it's sad when you're like the only one in your family that is deciding to go on that healing journey, and you see them suffer, and you see all of the pain that was caused by choosing to not heal, by continuing that generational trauma. And I wish I could just shake them and tell them, but I know I can't because it would be too much to handle. And I think that their religious environment gives them the comfort, the structure, and like the emotional highs that they need to give them hope. But I don't think it's in the long run, it's making their lives better. And I don't think it's causing them to grow as people.
Wow. Wow. And so, I mean, those are really powerful statements, I think. And I know that, when people talk this way about their family, there can be some worry about seeming harsh, and that you want to be a nice son and a nice brother. But I think what you're doing here is you're just stating facts as you see them, that you love these people and they love you, and you're not trying to say something hurtful, but there are times that you want to be able to hold a mirror up to your loved ones, and you want them to see what you see. And you also want them to see that things are better on the other side, and that they don't have to worry if they were to make that change, but they also don't have to worry about you, which is a really nice thing. I think also there is this real turnaround of logic where sometimes people are seen as weak when they leave, like they couldn't quite, keep with the commitments and the rules, etc. But I think it takes an inordinate amount of strength and bravery to do what you're doing, and also to be the only. I mean, people have that when they're the only, whatever it is, conservative or liberal in their family, or the only one who's converted, or the only one who, whatever, is doing something in a different way and is not willing to just sort of do what feels like the easier thing because inside there's too much turmoil, too much infighting inside your psyche and your body, I think, to make that okay. It sounds like your own voice had to get very loud for you to be able to really hear it and for it to guide you. It's a very hard situation to be in when you're a nice person too. And also that you're being treated in a certain way, or you worry about being looked down upon, that doesn't feel good at all.
No, it doesn't.
So I know, you now have done a lot of research into the university that you went to. And I know that it's not unlike others where there's a real control, absolute control over the people who are there. And I'm wondering if there's something you can talk about regarding that level of control and what impression it can give you about yourself when you're in that confined space emotionally and spiritually, that people are checking up on you and you have to, say what you've been doing, and somehow that you're not trusted.
Yeah. So I think the level of control in that environment, it was so hard to knowingly go there. And being gay in the closet, like, technically I wasn't even allowed to be there as a gay person anyways. They do not want any LGBTQ plus people at their college, and they make that very clear. And it's been hard leaving that environment, talking about it, because there's so much shame and blame for queer students who end up going to Christian universities. And I've had people online that comment and they're like, "Oh, well, you knew what you were getting yourself into. That's your fault. You should have never gone there. That's on you." And it's really harsh. And what people don't realize is a lot of us who go into these environments, there's not really any choice, because many of us, we came from an already high control environment with our very authoritarian families, our authoritarian cults, our authoritarian churches, and we're just going in the same environment, just hopping from one to the next. And so it was like I was put into a double bind of, like, I either go to a fundy college or I stay in the IFB. Like, there's not really a choice. And so the control that you're subjected to at Bob Jones and how it affects you, it's something I'm still grappling with. And it was interesting because when I went to Bob Jones, it wasn't as controlling as the environment that I grew up in, which is really sad. It was kind of funny to me because people, they would be like, I'm like, this university is so controlling. Like, I cannot rest. We're always so hyper vigilant. And I was like, I'm like, yeah, this is bad. But I'm like, I grew up in a much worse environment in this, but kind of like one-upping him, and I guess. And I'm like, this is no big deal, whatever. But it was still bad. It was still terrible. But it was just funny because I would meet people where they came from more liberal or a lot less extreme Christian environments, and they would go to Bob Jones and they're like, oh my gosh, I've never had any interaction with fundamentalist Christianity. This is absolutely terrible. I hate this so much. This is so harmful. And I think that's a thing that's deceiving about Bob Jones, is they don't advertise themselves as a fundamentalist Christian college. You'll look online and it will say a non-denominational Christian college, which is absolutely BS. It's not true at all. Not true. It's very, very fundamentalist. They have changed over the years, but they have a lot more progress to go. And so one thing I think that people need to realize when you go to Bob Jones University is that if you go to Bob Jones and you are coming from out of state, which I was an out of state student, if you are between the ages of 18 and 22, you are required to stay and live in their dorms on campus. You cannot live off campus and on your own if you're between those ages and you are from out of state. The reason they do this is the extent of control that they have in all these dormitories. These dormitories have a very hierarchical leadership structure. In each dorm, you would have a dorm supervisor. They're like the head leader of it. Then under them, they had a dorm mentor. And then under them, there were the resident hall assistants, which there was one resident hall assistant on each floor. And then under them were several discipleship group leaders on each floor. And then under the discipleship group leaders were the assistant discipleship group leaders on every floor. So you have all these leaders throughout all of this dormitory on every floor in this hierarchical structure where you are always being watched, always being monitored. And it's awful because you should be able to go back from your class, go back to the place where you live and have that sense of safety, have that sense of calm where you can just rest and be. But you can't even like listen to music that's secular. Like if you played secular music and a leader hears it, they will come into your room and you will get demerits for that. Or if someone comes in your room and you're watching a movie that's above like, I can't remember, I think it's PG or PG-13, you're getting demerits. And so there's all these rules and your room is checked just about every single day also. And that would happen when we were all at chapel. We would have room jobs. We had to clean the room just about every day. And there would be moments when you would go to your drawer and it's rearranged and you've realized that someone has been looking through your stuff. There's no sense of privacy. There's no sense of autonomy. And so then it makes you think your whole life and you're like, oh my gosh, like what do I watch? What do I listen to? Oh, what books do I have? Are these books, are they approved by Bob Jones University? You know, would I get in trouble if I had this book or if I'm even like contemporary Christian music? That was against their rules also. And they had a very strict dress code. In addition to that, you know, you're in this environment, you're always being watched. You have that feeling of being watched, and it keeps you in this state of hypervigilance. And for me, when I went to Bob Jones, I was like, I'm going to try to follow the rules as perfectly as I can because I was always such a goody two shoes growing up. I never broke the rules. I loved following the rules. But it came to a point where I realized that I was forcing myself or really conforming into this role that they wanted me to do. And it was something I'd been doing my whole life and that this wasn't me. It wasn't authentic. And it was just so much internal conflict and like psychological issues and mental health problems just from forcing yourself to be something that you're not, to constantly be like monitoring your own self and that's really what they want you to do. And once I started breaking the rules, for example, I was required to go to church 2 times a week. And they gave you a list of churches they approved of, and you had to pick from that approved church list. And you could not go outside of that list unless you went to their student life, which student life, long story short, they're just the people who give out all the demerits. And if you get into trouble, you'll end up at student life. And it has this extremely fearful culture in that environment. Like you don't want to go to student life. It's not a good day if you're going to student life. And so you would have to go to student life to tell them, oh yes, this is a church I want to go to. It's on the list. Can you approve this? So you're having people dictating where you can even just go to church and practice your own faith if that's what people desire. And, you know, for me, when I started breaking the rules, I learned that I could not trust anyone on that campus. And that's something a lot of survivors have told me too, is you have this feeling of like, you have no idea who you can trust because you don't know who's faking it. You don't know who's actually agrees with it. And it makes you fearful of like, oh my gosh, like if I tell someone that I don't even like going here or that I'm even breaking this insignificant rule, I could be turned in. And the reason we were so scared is that there were people on campus that we called Boges or Boges, and they were people that loved following the rules. they loved snitching on people who did not follow the rules. And usually they would report to like student life, or they were close with people at student life. So student life would have their own little minions that would go out and see who was breaking the rules and report on people. I mean, in addition to that, we still have all that control over us in the dorms. So here we are, so afraid of just someone who's a regular student, not knowing if there's someone who is close to student life or close to leadership who purposely goes around looking for people to snitch on. So for me, I really isolated a lot. And it's interesting because you already feel so isolated in that environment. And it was interesting because listening to the episode with Alexandra Stein and the triple isolation, it just really hit me hard with the isolation from people on the outside of the cults, and then isolation from people on the inside because you can't communicate what you're really experiencing, and then isolation from yourself because you're disconnected from your internal system and your own thoughts. So just all this isolation. And so when I started breaking the rules, so for example, just not going to church, the first time I didn't go to church, I accidentally slept in, and I hear the residence assistant checking every single room on the floor to make sure everyone is out by a certain time. And they would do this every Sunday morning. And my roommates were gone, and I have like 30 seconds to figure out what to do before this person comes into my room to check if I'm in there. And you're only allowed to be in the dorms on Sunday if you're sick, and you're supposed to tell them ahead of time. And I was not sick, and I did not tell them anything ahead of time. So I quickly slid against the wall in between my mattress, my bed and the wall, and I covered myself with a blanket. And I'm hiding in there, and I hear this person come in, and I'm like holding my breath as they're looking around, hoping they don't find me or hear me. And they leave, and I'm like, okay, they're gone.
Oh no, that is just so intense. That moment of being treated like a felon.
Yes. And it got to the point where eventually I learned to just, it's funny, I would get dressed in a t-shirt and shorts, and then I would put a dress shirt over it. I would put on dress pants over that. I would walk out of the dorm acting like I'm going to church, and I would leave and go by to a nearby park, and then I would go to the facilities and undress and get in my regular clothes and just enjoy the day in the park, because you didn't have a break at that place, because you didn't have a weekend, because church, you required to do that on Sundays. And eventually I was like, is someone going to catch me doing this? Is someone going to watch me? And eventually someone reported me because they saw me outside, like not going to church. They saw me walking alongside the road to, I think it was like this park, or maybe I was going to somewhere else, but someone saw me walking on the road. And I knew that because one of my teachers told me, oh, I saw you walking on the road on Sunday. And then that's all I said. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm like, I really love to take walks. I was like, what do I say? And it's just the way they said it was so passive aggressive. And I was like, crap. And so after that, I started being followed by my dorm supervisor. And I would notice that when I would go on walks, even on days when it wasn't Sunday, I would be followed by this person. And at first I'm like, am I being paranoid? Is he maybe just on a walk himself? And I remember being like, okay, well, I'm going to test this. I'm going to go down all these crazy, weird roads. Like, I'm going to go off the sidewalk and go down all these roads and see if they follow me. And they still, every road I turned down, they were really far. But like when you're at that school and you see these leaders, in your mind, you're like, okay, I know what they're wearing today. I know what they look like. So I can know to stay away from them. And this person was following me down every road I went. So when I got around a corner, I just started running like hell when I was out of sight from this person, because I didn't want them to know where I was going, because that was my only safe space from that school. And eventually they did find out where I was going, because there were some nights where I just needed a break and the dorms weren't a safe space. So I would, at night before curfew, I always made sure to get back by curfew so I wouldn't be in trouble. I remember going to this park I would go to. And when I get back, my resident assistant who was a main leader on our floor, he came into my room and he asked me, he's like, "Oh yeah, I saw you walking in the woods," which that was where the park was. It was a wooded area. And I stopped for a second. I was like, "I walked half a mile to get there. Like how did you know I was going to, in my mind, I'm like, how did you know I was going to be there? How did you see me? And you got back before me." Just all these things going in my mind. And he was like, he's like, "Yeah," he's like, "I saw you there. I just want to make sure you're okay." And in that environment, like if you're not emotionally healthy or if you're not mentally doing well, there's so much shame around that. So you just have to lie to these people and be like, "Oh yeah, I'm fine. I'm doing good." Because if you have mental health issues, you would meet with a biblical counselor, which it's not based on any kind of psychological evidence at all. It's based on the belief that all mental health issues are results of sin or not being in a close relationship with God. Trauma doesn't exist in biblical counseling at all. And so for me, I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm fine." And then he left, and I just goosebumps were going all over my body. And I was like, he knew where I was, because I just trying to understand how this person saw me there, because it was also a very dark area. So could be more anonymous. So it was at night. And so I was just like, crap. I'm like, am I on a list of people that they're watching? Like, does that exist, or what is going on? Thankfully, I didn't get any demerits, and like I continued to skip church and didn't get into trouble. I mean, 3 of the years I went there, I did not go to church, and I was able to get away with that. So
Wow, it's truly incredible. I know we're about done with time, but I think what's so interesting is hearing this part of your nature, which is to access your freedom, which I think is part of the reason that you're now on this side of the fence than not, that you have a real need to see what you can get away with. And within that context, what you're getting away with is kind of nothing, right? It's walking in the park, and right, or just sort of sliding next to your bed and putting something over you. Because I mean, it's not like you were, committing crimes or doing heroin. You're in the park, but still, just that idea of, or just having your regular street clothes underneath other clothes, just knowing you had that, the kind of hidden, that little taste of freedom, that you were going to be able to experience later, I'm sure was so much a part of what you needed, especially as you described, and that it wasn't even as intense as what you were raised with. I'm sure that it had been for quite some time, this need of yours to just push the walls out a bit, just to breathe and to see what you can get away with, even though that whole thing is so nerve-wracking. And it can really make your heart race. And, you can feel like cops are after you or something, even though you haven't done anything wrong. Right. And just having that revving, heart racing feeling, I'm sure it happened a lot.
yes, yeah. I mean, it really did. And I remember like the first time when I started breaking the rules, I was still so indoctrinated into that system, because when you broke rules and you went against authority, that was seen as going against God. That's how they had a lot of that control. It wasn't just disobeying these leaders, it was going against what God wanted, because God put these authorities in your life, and these are representatives of God. And so for me, I was so scared to do it. And I'm like, "Oh, God's going to punish me. God's going to do this," even though I don't believe in that anymore. But that's what I believed still then from that indoctrination. And I'm just like, you know what? I'm like, God can literally just strike me with the lightning. I don't care. Like, I'm just going to break these rules because I have to be human. I have to thrive. I have to take care of myself, because my mental health was in such a poor state. And I was like, you know what? I'm like, not going to church is so much better for my mental health. So I'm not going to do that. I don't care what these people say. And the hard thing is that they kept you so busy. And this is the last thing I guess I want to talk about, is like how they would keep you so busy in addition to just being a college student, having extracurricular activities and just working. They would keep you busy through requiring you to go to chapel several days a week. You would have discipleship groups that you were required to be a part of. You were forced to be a part of a society. And of course, like I said, you're forced to go to church every week. And this would take up, I would say for me, it probably took up around like 12 hours every week, in addition to all the just school, work, extracurriculars, trying to study and just be a student. And just for like an overview, like chapel was like a mini church service we would have several days a week in the Bob Jones auditorium. It was usually a time we would sing very like traditional songs. And the thing that like I really hated, and it really, even going there, bothered me a lot, was we would all, as a university, over 2,000 students in this auditorium, be reciting this creed together of things that we were supposed to accept as absolute truth and not question. And we would just all together in this like zombie-like state say this creed every time. And it gave me chills even in the beginning. Like I didn't have the language of like, oh, this is really culty, this is kind of cult like moment here, but it was just like so uncomfortable. And that's another moment of conformity of like, if you don't say the creed in the chapel time, there are sometimes people would follow you and ask you, why didn't you say the creed? I noticed you didn't say the creed. And sometimes you would be followed and questioned because you were supposed to say the creed if you believed it. And you were required to believe that to even be a student there. And so, I mean, for me, thankfully, no one followed me for not saying it, but I've heard stories of other people not saying it and being followed. And, and during this time, after that would be like a sermon. And most of them were usually very shame and fear based. Every once in a while, they would just have a sermon that's dedicated to like, because there'd be moments when like campus wide, there would be maybe be certain rules that a lot of students would break, and they would have to get back down on that by scaring us. And the rules were equated with being based on God's word and as the truth. So if you're breaking the rules, you're going against God. So again, that fear and control element that they had. And I remember, and like this kind of also I think shows the sexism at the school, is that there were a lot of issues with dress codes. And so I remember a very like stern, harsh 30-minute sermon just hearing about the dress code, because we usually didn't have to like be inspected. There are other colleges that would do this. There would be people placed in certain areas to watch students come in, like especially in the dining hall, to see if they were wearing their bright clothes. And if they weren't, they would be stopped and given demerits. And it was interesting because they announced in this chapel service, they're like, all right, the guys are going to have a dress check. It's going to happen. You're just going to literally walk into the dining common to go to lunch, guys, and that's your check. That's it. Just whenever you go to lunch today, and they'll check you. That's just as you walk in. And then they were like, all right, the girls, we're going to get up at this such and such time in the morning. You're all going to line up against the wall, and your resident hall assistant is going to be walking by, and they're going to be checking your dress. And when they said that, I just laughed to myself, because just the double standard is like, oh, guys, just walk in the dining common as you're on your way to lunch. But for the girls, no, you have to get up in the morning. You have to line up, get against the wall, and they're going to check you.
Incredible. Incredible, right?
Yes. And so that was, again, like that shame and that control that they continue through chapel. And society was the same thing as chapel. It was just student led, and maybe there was like a game involved. And for discipleship groups, it would then be another way to continue the indoctrination of what they're already preaching in chapel, because every semester we would get this special book that the president wrote that was based on all the sermons that he was going to preach that semester. And you would have this booklet. It was distributed to everyone, all the students on campus. This wasn't a book they sold. It was just for the students. It was not available to the public. And it was based on the sermons that were going to be taught that semester. And you would go through this every week in your discipleship group. And we would usually meet several nights a week when we needed to be in bed or just studying. And it was kind of late at night. I think we did it from like 10:30 to 11 at night. And if we didn't do this, we would get 25 demerits. It was required. So we were forced into these groups that would just continue the indoctrination of all the messages we were receiving on campus.
It's incredible. I think about the onslaught of information, of messaging, the contradictions, the ironies, all the things that it becomes quite exhausting because you're taking in all the information that they're wanting to embed in your brain and imprint in your brain, but you're also at odds with it in a growing way. And seeing things and having that emotional distance too, you're going to see more is going to come to the surface. Equations aren't going to come together. It can be all consuming in your brain then at some point.
Yes, most definitely. And it's interesting because after being out of that environment, I still struggle with just the fear of being watched. Even when I go on in a walk in my neighborhood, I'm like, am I being watched? Is someone watching me, having that stiffness and that hypervigilance still?
Right. One of the things that helps, and just as we're finishing up, one of the things that helps with the watched idea is to acknowledge it, to know that it was conditioned, that it was from a lot of repetition, but also sometimes when you have this recurring fear, when you're not in the same situation you were before that instilled it, it's good to actually go to worst case scenario and then realize that it's going to play out differently. So let's say you are being watched. So what? Right? Now it doesn't matter at all. And that sometimes also you can remember now you have a voice, you have rights, you don't have to be afraid of anyone, you're not doing anything wrong. And if they're watching, you can have that perspective of knowing that they have been told to do this, and they may or may not even want to be doing this, but they feel like they have to. And there are a couple of people I've worked with over the years whose job it was to help maintain the rules and to be the watchful eye and to report back. And that some of the time they were doing it, they wished they could be the person they were watching. They wished they had the ability, the nerve, the courage to do the thing that they weren't supposed to be doing. And they were almost living vicariously through them. And it was fascinating to hear that from the other perspective.
That's interesting. I've never heard that, but that makes sense.
Anyway, that's turning it on its ear,
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, thank you for what you shared, for sharing so much about your own moments of personal revelation over time and how hard won they are, because you have to fight against all of the fear-based messaging over and over again in your mind. And thank you for all that you're doing and the podcast that you're putting together. And that is going to be about Bob Jones and other things. I'm sure it'll tap into other things as well. And for helping with the podcast and helping it in terms of its social media, which is not an easy thing to do, to keep getting the word out. So I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you.
Thank you for saying that, Rachel. And I just want to bring it back to you. Thank you for all that you do. It's just, and thank you so much. Like, I'm so honored to be working for you and helping other survivors also. So thank you so much for having me on the team.
Of course. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.